I'm going to talk to you. First of all, it's lovely to be here, and thank you for being so welcoming and positive. It's just lovely, the humanity of this country and the people here, so thank you very much. So I'm going to talk to you about legacy and impact. Now, legacy, I think we need to understand in two ways. There's kind of a scientific legacy, which is about facts and figures and things you can prove happened because of what you did and how that takes you into the future. But there's another important side of legacy, which is the legacy of memory and the legacy of happiness and the legacy of pride. And we shouldn't lose sight of this. Our funders and our politicians will probably ask us about facts and figures. But I worked in Hull, which was a city that for too long had been told that it was no good. And it had been told that for so long, the people of that city started to believe that. And what our Year of Culture tried to do was celebrate the place, celebrate the stories of that place. And what you saw is people put their shoulders back and put their heads up and say, yes, I am from Hull, and I am proud of that. And in my view, that is the most powerful legacy of all. Okay? So what we tried to do is to bake this in right from the beginning, from the work we made to the outputs we got, to the results that to this day go on. So our City of Culture was in 2017, but there are still things happening now in 2024 that are a direct action of what we did. First of all, just so you don't know, there it is. There is Hull. And I put that on. This is the BBC weather map. And until we did Hull in 2017, Hull did not appear on the BBC weather map. And one of the things we did as part of our programme was to convince the BBC to put Hull on their weather map. Now this seems like a small act, but it was huge. And suddenly the people of the city were watching the BBC every night, and there was the name of their city. This is really important, right? And we split the year into 4 seasons because a year of culture is a very hard thing to do. So it was just easier for us to prepare and work it by splitting it into 4 quarters. The first one was called Made in Hull. And this really was about celebrating the stories of the place. We started with a big projection work all through the city, which took the stories of the city. Now, what you'll find in cities, and every place has this, is there are dominant stories that everybody talks about. In Hull, this was the fishing industry and the effect of Hull on Hull of the Second World War. These stories need to be talked about, but also they can be suffocating because they are such big stories, other stories get drowned out, or new stories aren't allowed to appear. So in our first act, we talked about the fishing industry and the Second World War, but that was also an opportunity to say, right, we've done that now. Can we please talk about something else? Okay? And one of the modern stories of Hull is that it is the centre in the UK for making wind turbine blades. This is a wind turbine blade. It is 75 metres long. It is made in one piece, and it is made a lot by hand. In fact, it is one of the largest single handmade objects that is mass produced in the world. And we thought they were works of art. So we took one and we placed it in the middle of the square of Hull to celebrate the work that the people did. And suddenly, from becoming an object of industry, it became an object of art. Sometimes things are very simple. This is a tower block where people live in Hull, and predominantly people with low wages. And all their flats had lights outside, and we went round and we asked them what colour they would like their light to be outside their house instead of just a normal white light. And when everyone had chosen their colour, their tower block just suddenly looked completely different. And more importantly, people in the tower block said, I have spoken to my neighbour for the first time, because it gave them an excuse to talk to each other. Really powerful, but really simple. And we did that with other stories as well. The godfather of electronic dance music in the UK, Basil Kirchin, was from Hull. A lot of people didn't know that, so we celebrated that. One of the biggest contemporary art movements in the UK, Coombe Transmissions, came from Hull, so we did a retrospective of their work. All of the Spiders from Mars who performed with David Bowie were from Hull. Not a lot of people knew that, so we celebrated that. We worked a lot with communities to find out what their stories were, and we needed to extract their stories from them. So for about 2 months, we created a 6-foot-tall, big, hairy monster that used to walk around, and every day it used to just attach itself to someone and be with them for the rest of the day. Even if that was a bank worker, it would go to the bank with them. If it was a small child at school, it would go to school with them. And the interesting thing about big, hairy monsters who don't say anything is that people tell them everything. And they told them their stories. And we collected those stories, and then we made them into big spectacle pieces of work with artists. So communities were seeing the stories of their place made into beautiful pieces of work. It made them feel proud. It made them feel connected with their place. We did this too with water. Hull is a coastal town. It's on water. We did a big show called Flood because Hull is in danger of flooding all the time. And so that was a way to talk about the issues with the environment that the city was facing. But interestingly, this project, we never talked about climate change because that's all scary and it's too big. We just made a show about flooding, and that allowed people to talk about climate change without forcing them to do that. We had a volunteering program. We had 2,000 volunteers, and I'm really pleased to say that 7 years later, those 2,000 volunteers are still on the streets in Hull. And what was really interesting is one of those volunteers said to me, I've lost £8 and I've made 10 friends. And we would call that health and social cohesion and, you know, all that kind of posh words that we use. But in one line, that person just said it all. You know, I've made a lot of friends and I've lost some weight. We also did a lot with education and learning for young people. These are puppets that young people voiced and put their voices into. It's easier for young people to talk about the issues that face them, or art, if they're doing it through playful means and puppetry. And finally, at the end of the year, we finished with a work called Where Do We Go From Here, where we put loads of these robots that you find in car factories, and we put mirrors on the end of them, and because they all worked with each other, the light was bounced all around the city, and it promoted a conversation about what happens now, okay? So these are not interim findings, they're findings that are well done now, because this is 7 years ago. But we looked at arts and culture, we looked at what we call placemaking, the economy, society and well-being, and partnerships. And what we found was, and this is the science of legacy and impact, 9 in 10 residents attended at least one event. 38% of people who booked to go to the theatre in Hull had done so for the first time because the City of Culture gave them a reason and excuse to go to the theatre. And for every event that we staged and funded, the city or someone in the city did something else. So we were a catalyst to other work. Do you remember the Blade installation? Well, like I talked about earlier, 1.1 million people passed by that sculpture in the 3 or so months that it was up. And 420,000 of them actually interacted with the sculpture. They stopped and they looked and they read and they talked about it rather than just walking past it. And 50% of those people said that they had come to the city to see Blade. 20% of them from outside. So you can see how this big public artwork had, attracted a lot of people. And frankly, if 50% of the 420,000 people, so 200,000 people had come in just to see Blade, if they all bought 1 cup of coffee, suddenly you've got the beginning of your economic impact because they're spending money that wouldn't have been spent unless they'd come to see the art. We measured pride. You see, now you can do this. Years ago, you couldn't measure pride, you couldn't measure happiness, but we saw 4%, 9% uplift in people talking about pride. And obviously we saw a big awareness raise in people knowing that the City of Culture was happening. And this is the important line because this is the national line. Obviously people in Hull knew about Hull City of Culture and more of them did. But when we started, very few people across the rest of the country did. But that went right up. And that's about... When people from Hull come out of Hull, no one says, where is that anymore, right? Because they know where it is, and that makes you feel good, right? We had uplifts in accommodation, obviously. Visits to our gallery went up by 500%. And obviously a lot of those people need somewhere to stay. So 80% of the people who went to our first event said it allowed them to talk to other people about the stories of their place. So the work that we made actually went into their mouths and now they own that work. And lots of people felt happier. And don't underestimate happiness. It's a very powerful thing. If you are happy, you are healthier. If you are happy, you are more ambitious. If you are happy, you don't tend to commit so much crime. So happiness is a really, really powerful thing. We saw uplifts of people from our deprived communities as well, engaging. And this goes on and on. It's really interesting, the scientific thing, but the stories and the happiness of the pride, I would argue, is much more important. And the fact that 7 years later, we've still got the gallery that we built is open and running. The volunteers are still on the streets. We're still doing more cultural activity in schools. The organisation that was set up to deliver the year still exists. And what it's found is it's doing more in visual arts in Hull now because that was the real gap. And ultimately, and I'll finish with this because this is the fun bit, this is what it all looked like.